Greetings from the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today I have in front of me the NEC PC Engine. Now, for those that don't know what this system is, the PC Engine is a console that was released in Japan around October 1987, and it was made primarily to compete with the Famicom. Now, we did get a system like this over here in the States, but it was under a different form factor and under a different name. That name being the TurboGrafx 16, which we got in August 1988. Now, what's interesting about this system is two things. One, this was marketed as the first 16-bit home console. And the reason why that's interesting is because it's a little debatable on whether or not it's truly 16-bit, as it has a 16-bit graphics processing unit, but an 8-bit central processing unit, or CPU. So I guess it's just really a matter of perspective, if you will. But more importantly, this system at one point in time did outsell the Famicom. Now, it didn't outsell it for long, but the point is, this was serious competition for Nintendo at one point in time, which is for good reason. Despite its small size, it actually had a pretty good library of games to go with it. Now, why do I have a PC Engine in front of me though? Well, this PC Engine needs a bit of work. As you can see, it's definitely seen much better days. It's definitely not the worst I've seen them, but I've also seen better. And even the controller here, while it's in decent condition overall, the bottom here does have some meltage going on due to the cabling here. And yeah, that's something to note. If you store controllers, don't store it like this, because chances are the sleeving might actually start burning the plastic. It's not the case with every controller type, but you know, best to be careful. But instead of like a basic restoration video or refurbishing video, what I want to do instead is build myself the ultimate PC Engine. Now, I got here a shell, or rather shells, from Retro Game Restore. And as well, I got me a few kits from various online retailers to really make this PC Engine shine. So, without further delay, let's get started. So we'll start things off by taking apart the main unit itself, which to get access, it's just 4 security bit screws in the back. Okay, so now that we got the 4 screws removed, we need to carefully lift the PC Engine out, as most of the hardware is on the top section here, and there is a really thick ribbon cable that connects the card slot to the main PCB. Now, it won't necessarily matter for me personally, but we'll get to that later. So, we're just gonna gently lift. And as you can see, we got that out. And in order to separate the card slot from the top shell, it's just 3 Phillips screws. Sorry about that. There was a screw that decided to lodge itself over here. So it took me a little bit to get it out, but I got it out safely regardless. And yeah, this is the inside of a PC Engine, folks. Rather compact system, if I do say so myself. But we need to get this thing prepped and ready to go for all the mods that we're gonna put in this thing to not only improve longevity, but also give it some extra features that it wouldn't otherwise have. But in order to do so, first order of business is we need to remove this bottom shielding here, and that's not too hard. It's just these 2 tabs here that are soldered in. So let me just fire up the iron and we can get to it. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in here on the back of the PC Engine, and we're going to be removing the card slot from the main board. So the reason why that we're going to be doing that is for two reasons. One, it gives us better access to all the main board components like the capacitors and the RF unit, which will be relevant later. And two, we're going to be removing the ribbon wholesale. And the reason for that is this ribbon sucks. Like, I'm going to be 100% honest. Trying to service or mod a PC Engine can be a nightmare because if you flex this ribbon too much, you could end up accidentally ripping one of the wires from the main board, and then you have to spend time like figuring out which wire ripped, and then you got to patch it up, and then you might end up ripping another one. Needless to say, this design is just kind of boo-boo, if you ask me. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to replace it with this. This is a replacement card extender made by Will's Console Modifications. And this is a really nice kit because not only does it have two little boards that connect the card slot to the main board, it also has a nice little in-between board that acts as a region switch. So we can be able to play US and Japanese games on the same unit. And it wouldn't necessarily be ultimate if it didn't have, some region capabilities, now would it? Now, how we're gonna do this is simple. We're going to flux up these two rows of pins here, add some fresh tin, and we're just gonna hit it with a desoldering gun. So, let's get to it. Okay, now that we got the card slot removed, we can now turn our attention to the main board. Now, to start things off, we're going to be removing some components on this board. Mainly, we're going to be removing all the capacitors because we're going to be doing a recap. The 7805 here, so I can update it with a 78S05. The controller port, because this controller port is a little squirrely on me. Sometimes it reads, sometimes it doesn't, and it definitely has seen much better days as well. And we're going to be removing the RF out port because we're going to be installing this. This here is the Turbo Nanza. This is a kit that was designed by my friend Zaxor, and what this kit does is it not only gives the PC Engine RGB output, but it also gives it properly attenuated composite as well as S-video output, meaning we have a few different options other than just RGB SCART to play the PC Engine. So I can use this system on anything between a consumer set CRT all the way up to the RetroTink 4K, if I wanted to, of course. So, without further delay, let's get to removing. All right, and with that, we got all the capacitors, the 7805, the RF unit, as well as the controller port completely removed. Now, I do apologize for like some of the jump cutting. I was struggling a little bit with removing the controller port as well as the RF module. The ground planes were just really holding on tight, so it was kind of difficult to get it out, but I was able to get it out with minimal to no damage. Now, something I wanted to bring up though real quick is I realized that I didn't really explain my technique when it involved these capacitors, because I'm pretty sure you saw, but the legs were kind of fanned outward. Well, what I did is, while holding the capacitor from the top, I would come in with my desoldering gun, and as I'm heating up the leg, I would wiggle the capacitor and then pull the trigger, and then just check to make sure that the leg actually moved around. You did see that I was struggling a little bit with C101. I figured that maybe I would have been able to clear the holes just fine with just one shot, but unfortunately I wasn't so lucky. Now, before I move on to recapping this board as well as installing the new 7805, I want to do something real quick, and it's going to involve C6280 here. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in here on the C6280, and the reason why is we're going to be lifting pin 29 here and tying it to ground. And the reason for that is pertaining to the region mod. You see, unlike the TurboGrafx 16 or Turbo Duo, we need to lift pin 29 and tie it to ground because TurboGrafx 16 games actually have one additional check that's placed in the software that looks at pin 29 of the C6280 and checks if it's tied low. If it's not, then the TurboGrafx 16 games will refuse to boot. Now, no such check is in place with PC Engine games, so it doesn't matter if it's tied low or not. PC Engine games will just boot no matter what, as long as the region is set correctly. Now, the way that we're going to do this is I would like to lift pin 29 and run a small Kynar wire to the little pad right here on C109. If I checked correctly, and we can verify with our multimeter, that this pin right here should be ground. Let me just make sure that, yep, one probe there. Yep, that's a ground pin. So before we install our capacitors, I'm just gonna run a little wire from here into that little hole. That way when we place the capacitor on, we can solder them both at the same time. So let's get to it. Sorry about that, folks. Unfortunately, when I was lifting the pin and soldering the wire, I was out of frame. So to explain how I handled this situation, basically I took my dull craft knife here, and while applying the soldering iron to pin 29, I came in with my dull craft knife and gently lifted the pin out of circuit. And once I confirmed that it was out of circuit, I folded it all the way back since, well, number one, like I said before, it doesn't really matter if this is tied low or not. PC Engine games will just work. And two, even if I wanted to kind of restore it back to stock for some reason, I can always attach a little component leg and it'll connect it back to the board all the same. But that out of the way though, I got my wire here attached to the negative end of C109, and it is stripped on the other side. So this is good to go. So now we can move on to recapping the board. So the process of recapping the PC Engine is no different than a lot of other systems that use through-hole capacitors. So we're actually going to start with C109 due to the fact that it has the little wire poking out of it, so, you know, why not start from there? So, simply put, we're going to take our 50-volt 1 microfarad capacitor, which is what C109 originally was. We're going to fan out the legs, and then fan them out once more, so that way they are parallel to the sides of the capacitor. And in terms of orientation, the white line right here, or the white mark right here, is going to be your negative lead, and the, well, the plus sign on the other side is going to be your positive lead. And that's what I really like about PC Engines. It clearly marks what capacitor is what and what position it's supposed to be in, but not just on the top side, but on the bottom side too. So that's a really smart idea, especially for servicing these consoles. But at any rate, we're going to hold this wire back just a little bit, so that way we can slide our capacitor in like so. I'm just gonna flip it on to the underside, make sure I'm in frame this time. Come in with our solder. Badoop. Badoop. And it should be golden. And just to verify, if this worked correctly, we should have a short to ground on pin 29 here. So we're gonna bust out the multimeter, set it to continuity. Let me just set that aside. My probes don't seem to be working. Oh, there we go. I don't know why. I think my my probes might need to be replaced, but we're gonna put one probe on that pin and another probe to ground. Yep. We got a short to ground, so that capacitor is installed correctly. So now we can move on to the rest of them. And with that, the main board is fully recapped. And as a bonus, I was able to reinstall the brand new controller port, but you may have noticed that one of the pads under the controller port side looked a little strange. And the reason why is because while I was getting ready to start recapping the board, I noticed that one of the pads was actually lifted. So what I had to do was I had to recreate the pad using a small strand of 30-AUG conductor. And because of that, I was able to restore that trace, and now this controller port should be good to go. So the next step before we install the 7805 is I'm going to perform the Turbo Nanza video mod to this thing. So let's get the board ready for the Turbo Nanza. Okay, so before we install the Turbo Nanza, I would like to perform one extra fix to this system, and that is the jail bar fix. Now, whether it's PC Engine, Core Graphics, the Duo systems, or even any of the TurboGrafx 16 systems, I find that all revisions of this hardware tend to exhibit jail bars through analog video. Now, it's not as noticeable through RF, but it is there. And it was discovered through Tim Worthington that the cause of this has to relate to the voltage rails. Now, the analog voltage rails and digital voltage rails have 4 capacitors here that don't really perform as well as they should, to put it lightly. So to fix this, all we need to do is replace 2 of these capacitors with 4.7 microfarad surface mount caps, which fortunately Console 5 does provide. So according to Console 5's instructions, we just need to replace C120 and C134, and our jail bar problems just go away. So all we're gonna do for that is apply a little flux, bring in our knife tip, just rock back and forth until it slides off. Like so. Do the same to C134. Oh, there we go. You don't want to knock off extra caps. And then, simply put, we're just going to add a little more flux. Add some fresh solder. And finally, let's get some tweezers. We're going to carefully install out the new capacitors on the board. Now you may notice that my gloves are off right now. I had to take them off because it's a little stuffy in my room. All right. Okay. Let me just do a quick close-up inspection. C120 needs to be adjusted a little bit. That looks pretty decent. I'll probably do some further adjustments off camera, but you get the idea. Just replacing C120 and C134 with 4.7 microfarad surface mount caps should do the trick for fixing our jailbreak problems. So, with that out of the way, now we can get ready with the Turbo Nanza. So we are nice and zoomed in here on this little resistor cluster here, and according to Zaxor's instructions, we need to remove these 4 resistors here, that being R134, R137, R138, and R156. As well, we need to remove R145. Now, R145 here correlates with the internal composite video, and these 4 resistors here correlate with Luma, phase blue, phase red, as well as the color burst information. The reason why we need to pull these out of circuit is because the Turbo Nanza has its own set of amplification and mixdown circuit that pulls these 4 signals in particular and mixes them down to S video as well as composite video. And because it's external, it should be a lot more cleaner than what you would expect from pulling it straight from the board. So what we're going to do is we're going to flux these up. And let's see if we can get a little bit of solder on the old knife tip here. Trying to make sure it's on in frame. And we're just going to simply, carefully remove each one. First one out. That's 2. These resistors can be a little stubborn. Oh, that's 3. You want to also be careful. You don't want to rip a pad. Actually, let's see if I can try to get it away from that. Oh, that's 4. That's 4. And we just need to do the same thing here for R145. All right, all 4 resistors are completely removed. So now we can move on to mounting the Turbo Nanza board. So mounting the Turbo Nanza is actually really simple. All we need to do is just take the kit here and mount it like so. So we're just gonna add a little bit of flux on the highlighted points, just to make sure that the solder flows in. I'm going to take my solder wheel. Doesn't need to be perfect, but let's tack one corner down. Let's try. There we go. Once you got a corner tacked down, then you just simply flow some fresh solder. All right, let me just take a quick look. It looks like one of these points is a little dry. It's a little difficult for me to see because the distance from the console and my vision. All right, that looks pretty good. So yeah, all we need to do is click on the ribbon and then install the 10-pin DIN mounting board. But before we do that, I think this board needs a bit of a cleaning. So let's get this board cleaned up before we move forward. Okay, so now that we got the board all cleaned up, we need to take care of one more thing before we move on to installing the DIN connector, and that is installing our wires for Luma, Phase Red, Phase Blue, and the color burst information. So we're going to be attaching our wires to these bottom section pads here, and it's a straight shot to these pads right here. So let's bust out some 4-pin ribbon conductor and wire it up. Okay, now that I got the Turbo Nanza all wired up here, we can now flip over the board and install the DIN connector. And don't worry, we'll come back to the bottom of the board later to install the ribbon cable here, but for now, let's install the other half. Okay, so we're here in the top section of the board, and you may notice that 2 of these grounding holes are actually already tinned up. And that's because I had to delete a ton of footage because I originally had installed this on the board. This is a mounting piece, so that way you could more easily mount the DIN connector to the board. And unfortunately, what I had discovered is this mounting piece actually elevates the DIN connector to a position where it would not be easy to just plug in your cables. Now, that's not the fault of Zaxor. I have a feeling that this mounting piece is supposed to be for the TurboGrafx 16, so I just used the wrong adapter. So what I had to do was not only get rid of all that footage, but get rid of this piece. So what we're going to be doing instead is we're going to just be mounting this 10-pin mini DIN straight to the board. And how we're going to go about doing that is we're going to take the bottom shell, and we're going to be taking our 10-pin mini DIN, and we just want to line it up in such a way that it's center with the bottom curve here. And for my eyes, that looks pretty good. And we also want to make sure that the 10-pin mini DIN is pushed all the way to the edge here. That way, when we go to plug in our cables, it will make a solid connection. Objection! Okay, future Fenris here with a user error correction. Now, you may have saw earlier, I said that I like to pull the DIN connector a little outward, so that way it was flush with the top shell. Well, it turns out you're actually supposed to have it flush with the PCB here, because what happens is when you try to install the Decadin FFC PCB here, it will start to obstruct the case and cause it to not close properly, even if you were to snip both of these posts here. So that's exactly what I did. I had to desolder the connector, pull it back, and solder it back on. And because of that, it is now properly aligned with the case. And while it is more sunken in, if I were to take a cable here, it should fit correctly, and it does. So we are going to move forward with the rest of the video. I am still going to show how to go about marking and scraping the PCB so that way you can get it prepped for the DIN connector, but just know that you need to pull it back to where it is flush with the PCB, not flush with the case. So let's move forward. So while we have it centered, actually let me double check. Yeah, we're gonna be taking a Sharpie and just marking along the edge. And that should be good. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be scraping up all of this solder mask all along here and within the square. That way we can have enough ground plane exposed to where this will lock in, basically acting as like a brace, if you will. So let's get the X-Acto knife and start scraping. Okay, so now that we got all that ground plane exposed here, we can now move our attention to the DIN connector. Now, something I did bring up in the footage previously that I did end up having to delete is that you may find that while trying to solder the DIN connector to the surface you're trying to solder to, that solder just does not want to stick to the DIN connector. It's not the case with every DIN connector, but some are just really stubborn and some aren't. So what I find to be the easiest way to ensure that solder sticks to the connector, and you can see there is some solder remnants here, is I take a flat file and I just go over the edges here, like really scratch them up, and then I test it with a soldering iron to make sure that solder will adhere to the surface without any issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring this bottom shell here, make sure that everything is lined up good and it's not sticking out anywhere. Place this DIN connector on, and we're going to solder it in. Alright, and with that we have the DIN connector all soldered up, and as you can see, that's pretty solid. Now, let's do a fitment test real quick, just to make sure that we are getting good alignment. Now, when you solder the DIN connector on like this, you do have to make one additional modification, and it's regarding the top case. We just need to cut this little support beam right here. Now, if we were using the stock case, we'd have to cut both of these support beams right here. But since we're using a clear translucent shell from RGR, we're just going to come in with our snips. I think those are my dull cutters. Let me just grab a fresh set, because this should snap, crackle, and pop like a Rice Krispie treat. It's always that little bit that's a little stubborn. And I'll come in with like an X-Acto knife to clean that up later, but if we did it just right, we should there we go. Get pretty good alignment, and that looks pretty good if you ask me. But just to make sure, let's grab our cable here, and yep, fits in like a glove. So with that out of the way, let's get the board out. And solder in the rest. Okay, so now that we got the DIN fully soldered in, all we need to do at this point is just install the Decadin FFC PCB, which simply put, all we have to do for that is just take the PCB, line it up, and plop it on. So I'm just going to solder this up and we can move on to the next step, which is going to be installing the 7805 and the cartridge flex PCB. So let's get to it. Okay, so we're here on the underside of the board, and there's one other thing that I need to take care of before installing the 78S05, and that is this right here. Now, this blob of solder is normally used for locking in the screw here, and I'm not really a big fan of that because the solder here is a very soft metal, so screwing and unscrewing constantly, I mean, granted, you shouldn't be doing that, but in the event that you do, this could wear out much faster. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that and replace it with this. Now this is an M3 sized nut, and I will be linking in the description below the different bits and pieces that I use to complete this modification. But needless to say, this is going to be a much more secure lock than this. So let's remove this solder and then we can move on to prepping the 78S05. Okay, so preparing the 78S05 is rather simple. All we need to do is just bend the legs out to match the stock 7805. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our needle nose pliers and just bend it down. It's good to go. Okay, last thing that we need to do is we just need to put the heatsink and 7805 together. So the way we're going to do that is first we're going to apply some thermal compound right here, and then we'll take the 7805 or 78S05, place it on like so. Then we'll take this little locking piece and place it above here like so. And then finally, we'll thread through the machine screw that locks everything in place. So without further delay, let's put Humpty Dumpty together again. Okay, so there's just one more thing that we need to take care of before we install the flex cable for the Turbo Nanza, and that is the ribbon fixer from Will's console mods. Now, installing this, you want to pay attention because there are two different types. There's the main board, which also says mainboard EXP port, and then there's one for the card slot. You don't want to mix these two up, otherwise you might ruin something. So the way to install this is actually pretty simple. All we gotta do is just line it up like so. It's not gonna be perfect, but it just needs to be lined up good enough to where it will make contact with the solder holes below. So I'm just going to flow some solder through and we're gonna get this linked up. Okay, so after going over it once more off camera, we got the first half of the ribbon fixer installed. So now all we need to do is just give this board one more good cleaning and we can install all the flex cables for both the Turbo Nanza and the ribbon fixer. So let's get this scrubbed up off camera and we'll install some ribbons. Okay, so now that we got all that excess flux cleaned up, we can now install the ribbons. So starting with the Turbo Nanza, we need to unlatch this and then install the shorter ribbon with the blue tab facing outward. So, see if I can get in there. Make sure it's really in there. And then lock it in. And the reason why we're starting from the top is because it's easier to start from the top. Come in like this. And then do a bend, not a sharp fold, but a bend. So that way we can see what we need to press. So. And there we go. So, as for this excess, we just pull until we get a nice straight ribbon, and then we just lightly press. Lightly press. And we're good to go. So, moving on to the ribbon fixer. Okay, so this was something I didn't notice at first, but I forgot to set the low pass filter jumper. So we just need to bridge those 2 points just to make sure that the low pass filter is off. And there we go. Now we can move on to the ribbon fixer. Okay, so we're nice and focused here on the ribbon fixer. And much like the Turbo Nanza, all we need to do is lift up in the tab, install the flex cable with the blue facing outward, and then actually make sure it's straight, or as straight as it can be, and clip it down. All right, and with that, all the mainboard stuff is now done. So now we can move on to the final steps, and that is the card slot. So let's get to it. All right, so first order of business, we need to remove the rest of this big honking ribbon, as well as this capacitor here. So we're going to flow them all up with some fresh solder and hit it with a desoldering gun. Okay, so now that we got the old ribbon removed and the new capacitor installed, we can now move on to installing the other half of the ribbon fixer. And simply put, we just take the PCB that's marked as card slot and plop it right here. And as you can see, this time we can actually line it up better with the solder holes, since there's actually a little bit more room for us to work with. But we just line it up, solder it in place, and we should be good to go. Okay, so I got the other half of the ribbon fixer all soldered up here, and what we're going to do is we're going to just put everything back together kind of roughly. Got to make sure that this system is good to go before we move on to the final steps. So I'm going to boot up my RetroTink, and we're going to give this thing a test. Okay, we got everything set up here for testing. We got the main unit here, and we got a copy of Splatterhouse plugged in. And now we're just going to plug in a cable and give it a test. Now, starting with composite, something I should mention though, when plugging in your cables, since the DIN is mounted upside down, you have to make sure to plug your cables in upside down. So never do it with arrow facing up. The arrow needs to face down. So we're going to flick on the power. And look at that. Looks like our unit's working. But does it play? Let's take our controller here. Looks like it plays. Right, left, down, up, punch, jump. So all of our buttons work. Alright, so let's swap over cables to S-Video and give that a test. And that's going to be the real star of the show for this mod, because S-Video is not a common modification for PC engines, and the ones that typically have S-Video mods, and they tend to be okay, but not that great. Just plug that in. Since we don't have a shell, I need to hold it with my hands just to make sure that it's a solid connection. Make sure that... Oh! Plugged in the RGB cable. That would actually explain a lot. In my defense, they are about the same thickness. And we got S-Video. We don't have audio for S-Video because audio for the RCA jacks is being taken over by composite, but as you can see, we got S-Video. Alright, and finally, we're going to scroll over to RGB SCART. Unplug that. Plug in our RGB SCART cable. And we got RGB SCART. Alright, so this modification is good to go. But before we put it in the case, we need to install one additional thing, and that is this little guy right here, which is going to be our region mod. So let's get the shell ready for the region kit. Okay, so as you can see, we have the top shell here, and in preparation for the region mod, what we're going to be installing is this. This is a 2-position on-on switch, and we're going to be mounting it where the RF switch used to be. So the way we're going to be going about this is I'm going to be drilling 2 small holes, and we're going to lock this switch in with some M2 screws and nuts. Now, granted, yes, I could use adhesives to lock it in. I'm not really a big fan of that. It doesn't look really clean. So I'm just going to punch a couple holes and feed some screws through. So the way we're going to go about this is we're going to invert the switch so we can have the screw holes like so. And we want to line up the rightmost post here with the groove of the RF hole. So that looks to be about good. And I'm just going to come in with my Sharpie, mark the first hole, and mark the second. And that's where I'm going to be punching my 2 holes for my screws. So let me bust out the drill and punch some holes in. Okay, so we got our drill bit kit here, and it looks like out of all the drill bits that I have, 3/32 is what matches closely to our panel mount switch here. So now that we got our drill bit, we're just gonna lock it in the drill and punch a couple holes. All right, so I got my 2 holes drilled in. So if we take our switch here, that looks to be perfectly aligned. So now we're just gonna take a couple of 4mm M2 screws, feed them through. Part's a little tricky, but we're gonna now take our M2 washers, and we're going to just finger tighten them real fast. We just need to get them in temporarily, so that way we can make sure to do some final adjustments. They don't need to be super tight, just tight enough. We want to make sure that our switch can still actuate, and it can. So now we can come in with our screwdriver and finish locking it in. I got it a little crooked, so loosen that up. Alright. Looks good to me. So let's install the region mod. Alright, in terms of installing the region kit, we have 2 pieces that come with it. So first here is the PCB. Now it notes which side goes where. So according to this PCB here, this side connects to the card slot and this side connects to the motherboard. And to do that, we have a spare ribbon cable. So this ribbon cable is going to connect to the card slot, to which then this connects to this PCB. So let's get it all mounted up. Alright, all that's left to do now is to solder 3 wires from here to here. So let's get to it. Alright, and with that, our region mod is now fully installed. Now, to test the region mod, we are going to use our multimeter and just see if our switch is actually working as intended. So, our multimeter is on. So, it's currently positioned downward, or rather this is going to be the switch position 1. So we got continuity there. So if we turn off the switch, we shouldn't have continuity anymore. And we don't. But we should have continuity here. And we do. So the way we have this switch set up, the second position is PC Engine, and the first position is TurboGrafx 16. So now that we got that installed, we're basically done with all the hardware installs. So now we just got to put it all together and call it good. Okay, so now for the reassembly process. So first order of business is we're going to disengage the clip here, take the other end of the ribbon, bend it upward, flip it over, and we're just going to lock it in place with the mod chip. Alright, that's locked in. And now, when putting the PCB back in, you do have to keep in mind we do have a switch that's kind of in the way from where the Turbo Nanza sits. So you just need to kind of come in and scoop underneath like so. And there we have it. Now we got the PCB in. So we're going to take our bottom shell, lock that in place, and do some final touches. Actually, before we put this thing fully back together, there's just one more thing that I forgot. The power slider. Can't necessarily operate the PC Engine with that one now, can ya? Alright. Now let's get the bombshell back in. Actually, one more thing that we need to take care of before we put the bombshell in is we need to remove these two plastic tabs here, so that way it doesn't end up hitting the Turbo Nanza. So we're just going to come in with our snips. And problem solved. Alright, and with that, the system is done. So we just need to add one little detail to really finish the look here, and that is a sticker from Graphics Gear. So we're just gonna get one corner, and right here looks to be okay. Yep. There we go. Now we have a TurboGrafx 16 mini console. But what's the point of having a console when we also need the controller? So let's work on the controller real fast. Okay, now that I got the controller part, we can start by first cleaning the membranes. And how we're going to do that is pretty simple. Q-tips and isopropyl. So let's get to it. Okay, so I have the system all hooked up here. I even got the controller all plugged up, and we're going to be doing some final testing. So we're primarily going to be testing the region switch. So I currently have the region switch set to region 1, which should be TurboGrafx 16. So we're going to plug that in, click on the power. TurboGrafx 16 works. Flick off the power. Now we're going to switch it to region 2, which should be PC Engine. So we're going to plug that in. We got PC Engine. So while we're at it, let's test the controller real quick. Right, left, down, up, punch, jump, turbo punch, turbo jump, pause. Everything's working. So one other thing that I want to bring up about the Turbo Nanza is that it's equipped to handle the expanded audio capabilities of the Turbo EverDrive Pro, meaning if you want to play CD games through your Turbo EverDrive Pro, you can with this mod. Now, I should mention that I don't have a Turbo EverDrive Pro to demonstrate that, but I do plan on getting one in the future. Now, as far as final thoughts, this is by far one of the more frustrating consoles for me to work on. There were plenty of times where I was struggling to really film the mod process. I mean, there's actually several cuts I've had to do where I was trying to install wires, but then like something went wrong. Either like a wire wasn't connecting, or the wires were too short, or I cut them too long, you know, things like that. And as well, there was the whole DIN connector issue. Like, had I done a dry fit of this PCB right here, I would have seen that it was raising the DIN connector too high. And as well, I should not have pulled the DIN connector much closer to the case when the instructions clearly stated that it needed to be flush with the board. And that was me just trying to see if I could improve upon the install in some way, but obviously I could not. It was set up that way for a reason. So, and it got me thinking. See, when I film these videos, I always try to present myself in a somewhat professional manner. I don't like filming videos where I'm constantly guessing what could be wrong or how to go about fixing or modding a system. When I do these videos, I do them because I already have experience with working on these systems, and I want to share my experience with all of you. So it can be really discouraging when you're faced with a lot of issues because you have things like a microphone in front of your face, or having to make sure that your board is within shot, or having to correct errors that were entirely your fault. But if there's anything that I can take away from this install, it has to do with a phrase that I personally go by. Every failure is another step towards success. You can't expect to grow unless you fail. And you're going to fall on your face a lot and fail. Like, it doesn't matter if you have 1 month of experience or 10 years of experience. You can be faced with something that you have plenty of experience of, but then still struggle to deal with it because of X, Y, or Z variables. But that's okay. It's better to take away what you've learned from that experience so you are better prepared for when you have to deal with that situation again in the future. It can be really hard, and it can be really tough because you feel like you're incompetent when working on this stuff. But really, much like with anything in life, you're just learning. So it's best to just take the lessons as they come. Anyways, guys, thank you all so much for watching. I'm sorry it's taken me a bit to get another video out. This system has just been really testing my patience, to say the least. But in any case, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And once again, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.